Welcome back to the lecture of trading permits and carbon credit markets under the environmental regulation topic of environmental economics. We have been talking about the carbon credit market under this lecture, and we said that these markets aim to reduce emissions by putting a price on carbon pollution. Now, carbon credit market is a mechanism that enables the trading of emission permits, also known as carbon credits. Trading enables the entities or the stakeholders that can reduce emissions at a lower cost to be paid to do so by the higher cost emitters. By putting a price on carbon emission, carbon credit mechanism raises the awareness of environmental and social cost of pollution, carbon pollution. So a price, when you price a commodity, which is here emission, you are trying to seek the value of reducing it. And it encourages the investors, the producers, the firms, companies and the consumers also to choose a lower carbon pathways of existence. Here we talk about the certifications. Certificates that represent the reduction or sequestration of 1 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions. That is called as COTE. CO2e is carbon dioxide equivalent emissions. So 1 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent considered as a unit of emission reduction. And these certificates have that quantity of reduction in carbon emission as a value given to by the certifications. Entities can buy and sell the carbon credits, allowing those who can reduce emissions more easily to do so. And then they can sell the excess credit to those who find it more challenging to reduce. Therefore, it's a very feasible and a very comfortable system where the burden is being shared by the entities. There are stakeholders who find it difficult to reduce the carbon emissions given the cost, maybe a higher cost firm which involve or incur a higher value of reducing the carbon emission. So one can, those entities who have excess of carbon emission or after trading, those credits can be bought and sold, and they can buy those credits by the ones who have higher cost of reducing emissions can take advantage of this particular system and gain from the carbon credit market. Now, carbon credit market has two aspects, two broad aspects. One is a compliance market and the other one is a voluntary market. Now, it is important to understand the compliance market system and a voluntary market system under carbon credit market. Compliance market system involves cap and trade. For example, the various examples we saw in the shortly that we saw that various countries who have implemented carbon and trade and who have had experience of implementing this policy of carbon trade. That is a compliance market. It is a part of carbon credit market only, and cap and trade policy was implemented where you can have a marketable permit system which was in the form of cap and trade policy. So it is considered as a compliance market, while we have another type of market which is called as a voluntary market, and under voluntary market you have Plan Vivo. Plan Vivo is a very specialized kind of market which exists and which has not a very wide application has been noticed under this voluntary market, but compliance market has been implemented from a long time, and various countries have various experiences under this compliance market. So compliance market, if you see, it sets up a mandatory limits on emissions, and companies are required to hold enough credits to cover their emissions or purchase additional credits if they exceed the limit. So, in the compliance market, you already have a mandatory limit to emit, and within that limit, companies, they require to hold credits of reducing emission. So, within that limit, there are several companies who would be complying with this mandate, and they will hold credits in the form of certificates for reducing emission. With these certificates of reducing emission, they cover their emissions and they purchase additional credits if they want to increase the limit of emission. So, if you want to exceed that mandatory limit, you need to buy more credits, and with that, you can exceed the limit. One of the greatest example, as we talked about, is cap and trade system. Cap and trade system sets a mandatory limit, which is cap. The term cap itself prescribes a mandatory limit on GHG emission, and it is prescribed by the regulator on various organizations according to their system and according to their production processes. And once they exceed these limits, they can purchase excess allowances to fill the gap or pay a fine. So, purchase of carbon credit itself means an act with that you are bringing a price for emission, and you are valuing or increasing, you are giving a value of reducing emission. Activity that involves emission is being priced, because to emit more, you have to buy more credits, and to emit more, there is a fine in the form of credit, carbon credit. So that is why, or you can say allowances you have to buy. Purchase more allowances to emit more is the basic fundamental behind this entire system, which is being captured in the form of cap and trade policy or a compliance market, which functions under the compliance market. While voluntary markets have a different nature, voluntary markets offer a non-voluntary environment for companies to purchase credits to offset their emissions voluntarily. Now, there is no mandate or there is no compliance by the regulator, but here it is voluntary. It is motivated by your own self-interest and your own ideology and your own interest to save the environment. Voluntary markets enable the trading of carbon credit outside of the regulatory environment. So, though it is a part of regulation and it comes under the MBI and it comes under the carbon credit market system, under the carbon credit market system, voluntary markets and compliance markets are created. Carbon credit market system, they open a space or a scope for people who want to voluntarily use the market, and voluntary come under the system of carbon credit. However, there is compliance market which is in the form of cap and trade, which brings in the mandatory policies and mandatory permits. So it is up to the regulator and the nation or the country or the state to implement whichever policy is feasible for their system and for their socio-economic system, socio-economic and political system. Compliance carbon markets. Now, we go a little deeper to the compliance carbon markets, where cap and trade, which is one of the ways or one of the method of compliance carbon markets, cap and trade lets the market find their least expensive way to cut the emissions. So, it is a more efficient method of reducing emission because it is cost effective, while driving the technological innovation and economic growth. Technological innovation comes under this because it has a feature of energy transition, which is taken care by the sources of energy you are using, and that also gets credit. The efficiency part also, renewable transition to renewable energy and efficiency, these aspects and these elements are also taken into account. So while we are transforming and while we are innovating technologically, we are also addressing the least cost expensive way or the cost effectiveness through the cap and trade policy. Cap is upper limit on the amount of carbon emission a company can legally produce. On the other hand, as the cap is reduced for the future years, total pollution declines. So initially you may have a higher end cap, but later, slowly, gradually, you will see that cap level or the benchmark, the threshold level keeps on reducing over time as the requirement of reducing emissions keeps on declining in future according to the requirements. Now, there are various kinds of entities or stakeholders come under this cap and trade policies. Electric utilities, refineries, and large factories with emissions that exceed the pre-established amount of carbon tons per year. They must hold an allowance and they must hold a permit to emit. And emit what? Emit in terms of 1 ton of carbon. The unit is 1 ton of carbon. So various electric utilities, they come under this compliance of carbon credit markets, carbon markets, and that is cap and trade. So these entities by default, they find their way under the compliance carbon markets, which are electric utilities, refineries, and large factories with emissions that have exceeded a pre-established amount. So there are certain infrastructure base which involves emissions by default and to a larger extent. So they all by default come under the compliance carbon market. They also follow the offset carbon credit equivalent to their annual emission. These organizations enter a compliance carbon market where the carbon credits can be bought and sold. So once they are under the compliance carbon market, these entities which are heavy polluters or they are heavy emitters, they can be bought and sold, and carbon credits can be bought and sold under the compliance market. In certain jurisdictions such as as we have seen the European Union case, and also we have seen in the California company's case, which is required as a cap and trade policies, the laws are very, very important. Laws to offset the carbon footprint they make the foundation or the setting up framework for bringing in these kinds of market. So there is a huge role of judiciary and law structure which is to be prepared along with the market system. Cap and trade lets the market find the least expensive way, and it draws the technical innovations also. Once we see the California cap and trade program, which earlier also we have mentioned that it was created a way long back, and it led to lower levels of state greenhouse gas emission, is one of the breakthrough example of compliance carbon credit market. It is a key part of California's strategy to reduce GHG emission, which is at the levels which were before 1990 levels. So it was a remarkable success when it comes to cap and trade policy. It is one of the remarkable case study which one can quote related to cap and trade policy, California's success. Now we move to the next type of carbon markets, which is voluntary carbon markets. Voluntary carbon markets, they include all type of transactions of carbon offsets, not purchased with the intent to surrender them into an active regulated carbon market. So we visit the definition again, which says the voluntary carbon marketplace includes all type of transaction of carbon offsets not purchased with an intent to surrender them into an active regulated carbon market. So basically it is not mandatory market, it is voluntary, and it is basically a market that is created for those investors or those entities, stakeholders whose transactions of carbon offsets are purely on a voluntary basis, and they can undergo the buying and trading of carbon credits. And voluntary carbon markets, they perform the trading as usual, intending to meet the carbon neutral. So basically the aim of whoever is entering the voluntary carbon markets is basically to reduce and to become carbon neutral for environmental purpose. So aim of this voluntary carbon market is just basically to meet the carbon neutrality. And carbon neutrality, you are actually actively contributing to carbon neutrality. So the aim is very clear in case of voluntary carbon markets. On the other hand, compliance market, the motive is different. Motive of compliance market is to emit, and emit efficiently with the price of emission and price of permit. While the aim of voluntary carbon market is to finally become carbon neutral. So the entire motivation or the vision or the objective of both the markets are differentiated when it comes to the motivation of these two markets on the basis of which they are implemented or they are functioning. The voluntary market is driven by the companies and also the individuals that take the responsibility for offsetting their emissions, and there is no mandatory policy that is driving them. It is they themselves are equally motivated to reduce emissions, and these entities that purchase offsets before emissions reduction and are required by the regulation. So these entities, they purchase the offsets, basically carbon credits, before the emission reductions are required by the regulators. So basically they are buying and selling the carbon credits or trading with the carbon credits without any regulation. So that is the fundamental difference between the voluntary carbon markets and the mandatory, that is compliance carbon market. Buyers are driven by the corporate social responsibilities. So who all are buying under the voluntary carbon markets? These are the individuals, basically institutions, the organizations, or you can say companies, entities who are contributing to corporate social responsibility, CSR, the ethical responsibility, and a desire to enhance their reputation in the society. So with this, they give value to environment, and they basically endorse their valuation towards environment by buying and showing the carbon credits. And that is the whole motivation to buy the carbon credits. They do not buy the carbon credits just for the sake of regulation, and they are self-motivated carbon credit market participants or players. Pre-compliance buyers may want to purchase credits at a lower price before the new requirement kick in. So pre-compliance buyers, you may call them as pre-compliance buyers, and they may want to purchase the credits at a lower price because they know So how does the price of credit market works here? They would like to buy it at a lower price because they would know that the compliance would pitch in, and at this one point of time there will be time when the prices of these credit system will go up. So before that prices shoot up, they would like to buy at a lower price. So the trading starts much before the compliance takes off. And this is how the voluntary carbon markets function. Voluntary carbon markets may be smaller than the compliance market, but they are more flexible and innovative in terms of finance, monitoring, and methodologies. Because they are on the basis of voluntary system, so therefore when it comes to financing these voluntary system market, they are more efficient. The finances that are needed to support the system are easily and much much feasibly done as compared to the compliance market. Even the monitoring and regulation systems are more systematic and in place. One of the greatest examples of voluntary carbon market is Plan Vivo. Plan Vivo is not a very popular method of voluntary markets, but it has found its way. Plan Vivo, it's also called as PVC or PVS system. Plan Vivo is a certification body, and that administers the Plan Vivo standards. It is a proven framework for the community, and it takes into account the kind of monitoring and the compliance it takes into account is much wider than the emissions. It takes into account the activities which are related to land use, activities related to forestry projects, and environmental projects which are into protection of environment as well as the living and non-living environment, which involves the species restoration, the coastal area restoration. So the gambit or the area, the scope of jurisdiction, or you can say the scope that is allowed under the voluntary carbon markets or certification that is allowed under this system is much greater than just the carbon emission reduction. The credits are based on the land use, the credits are based on the forestry projects which are undertaken, the agriculture projects, organic agriculture projects which are undertaken, and whatever initiatives one has undertaken at an individual level, organization level, institutional level, and that they comply to make a difference in the environment. So all these activities are taken care by these kind of carbon markets, which are voluntary carbon markets. Plan Vivo makes a difference, and it is possible to generate a result-based payments to the participants. Credits or the certification that is generated under this particular system can be sold on the voluntary carbon markets. So the certificates generated by this platform can be traded on the voluntary carbon market system. So this was regarding the voluntary market system. One can see that a lot has happened when it comes to carbon credit market system, and we have seen that how the theories have evolved of environmental regulation from command and control, market based policy or market based instruments, and how various tools we have, the regulators have to comply with the carbon emission reduction. So these are the ways in which one can see the carbon reduction methods that can be implemented in various ways. India, as we move on the path of carbon reduction, in the past that Indian industries were familiar with the implementation of both compliance market and voluntary market also. We have done a lot in the past, and there's a lot to be done in the future. Ever since 2015, we have been talking about the compliance and voluntary carbon markets, though it is not being picked up in a concrete manner, but the structure and the system and that the framework has already been laid down. It has to pick up in a more effective and in a more effective policy way, state-wise both and as a at a central level. And the names which we can quote is PAT, ESC, and REC, and Clean Development Mechanism, CDM. These are two ways in which India's carbon market have already been structured, and they have to pick up from there and promote more in a better way, in a more monitoring and in a more transparent way, and so that all the stakeholders can avail the policy and can participate in the carbon and benefit from their layout. So India has already planned out the implementation of compliance market and voluntary carbon market in the form of CDM and PATS, EXCURS and RECs. RECs, they have already have the scheme in place, and 106 million tons of carbon dioxide emission have been traded, able to save basically 106 million tons of carbon dioxide emission have been saved since 2015 till to 2024. So given the fact that these schemes are already in place and one have already saved a substantial carbon dioxide emission using this platform of carbon trading and carbon emission markets, till 2024 there's a huge future to be a future waiting for us to implement the policies in a better framework and a better structure that can be implemented at a local level, at a state level, because we have a federal structure. So one can utilize this framework, shaping according to the state requirement, according to the local regulator requirement, and there can be a 2 to 3 level framework which can be implemented, which can be revisited under policies. And I think and it is to be informed that the framework is going to be is underway, and it will be uh, in a policy frame. It is going to come in a better carbon credit policy framework in the coming days. So we will visit the India's carbon credit trading system story in the part 2 of this entire discussion and in this lecture, which is about the carbon credit market and marketable trading systems, marketable permits and carbon credit market, part 2. So we will continue talking about India's credit trading system in the next lecture that is on the way. So the entire lecture was based upon the theory of Kolstad. Kolstad of 2011, Intermediate Environmental Economics, is the basic book or reference from which the lecture was based on, and the India's credit market trading system that will be talked about in the next lecture will be taken from the Government of India portal, and we will talk about the carbon credit system of India in the next lecture. Thank you so much for your patience.